Hey, welcome to Houston Newsmakers Extra, where I'm joined by what I'm calling education royalty. As it concerns the topic of education, I'm serious about that. Those of you watching the program, Dr. Ruth Simmons, who's a former president of Prairie View A&M University, and before that Brown, and before that Smith College. I was thinking to say Spelman, where you were provost at Spelman. So many different things. See, education royalty. And Dr. Ruth Lopez Turley, who is the director of the Kinder Institute for Urban Research, and Dr. Aaron Baumgartner, who is the director of HERC, which is the Houston Educational Research Consortium, an organization founded by Dr. Lopez. It's 11 HISDs. So we're talking about the takeover of HISD, or impending possible takeover of HISD by the TEA. You haven't been dealing directly with high schools, but you have been dealing directly with the state government and how it deals with these kinds of things. What was your reaction when you heard that this may be a possibility? Clearly, it started some time ago, but now it's just kind of ginned up and is a little bit more active right now. Your thoughts?
Well, I was surprised and perturbed, I guess. I have spent some time at Wheatley, my high school alma mater, recently, and I've been very much aware of the efforts underway by the new superintendent and the new principal there, and I was very hopeful that we had passed this era where people were talking about shutting down schools and taking over schools. As an educator, I understand what it's like in that milieu. Teachers, principals working their hearts out to help their students. Their students bring many different backgrounds to the schoolroom, and they are trying to overcome all of that diversity and to instill in young people a dream to be on a path of self-improvement, of transformation, to be able to do anything they want to do in life. And that's a very powerful thing that these schools do. And so it's easy to look over that and to say, well, you know, maybe this should happen or maybe that should happen. But get into the schools and see what's going on and the tremendous job the teachers are doing and principals are doing. And then you'd be better informed, to be sure. In
your roles at the Kinder Institute and HERC, you are doing that. You're working hand in hand with the school districts, HISD in particular. I know that recently there was a research study that was done that indicated that mental health was some of the things that they really wanted. That was a priority. Yeah. But that's not being talked about very much. We're not hearing a lot about that. Your thoughts about that?
And that's being expressed by students, right? So we asked students and parents and teachers what students' most urgent needs were in sort of every other area besides instruction. And by and far, what we heard from students was mental health support. And so there are a lot of barriers to finding those supports: cost, the ability to find it, and the stigma that comes along with accessing those resources. So to the extent that we can really think holistically about the needs of students, that's where we need to be doing. And
you've been providing research and gathering research about all of the educational challenges that are going on within the school systems generally, and now with HISD in the spotlight of TEA. What are you telling both sides now about what might possibly happen? I mean, the research you've been gathering indicates that it's not a positive thing when states start getting into the business of takeovers.
Right. We want to make sure that people are aware of what the research has to say about state takeovers, which is not very promising. But also, we want people to be aware of what research has to say about what does help students. And we want to combine that with the research that we've done locally about what we know that students need, what they've indicated, like the survey that Aaron just referred to, which, by the way, was a survey on over 45,000 students. So we have a really good sense of what their needs are, and now we need to meet them. And the great thing about all the improvements that HISD has made so far, and to be clear, many more improvements are needed, but we are optimistic about the direction that they're headed because of the fact that they are taking very seriously what research has to say. As soon as the superintendent arrived, the new superintendent, Millard House, well, I don't know if he's new anymore, but newish, as soon as he arrived, he reached out to us and said, I know that you all are currently doing research for HISD. I want to make sure that the strategic plan that is developed is informed by that research. And we spent a lot of time, Erin in particular spent a lot of time with the superintendent, with the chief officers, going over what the research has to say about what is needed at HISD. They asked some tough questions. I have to say, kudos to the district for being willing to ask tough questions, such as how inequitable are we, and in which areas, what needs to be improved, and how can we document those inequities so that we can monitor progress over time.
Isn't that something that has occurred across both secondary and college levels? The equity or lack thereof is just, it seems to have widened in so many different areas. At least it hasn't changed an awful lot from many years ago. I did a story about 20 years ago, no more, longer than that now, almost 30 years ago, when I was in Miami, doing a story on the gap, the education gap. Mm-hmm. And that doesn't seem to change an awful lot, which means maybe race is involved in some of that. How much is race or racism involved in some of the inequities we're seeing in our educational systems now, Doctor?
I don't know if it's race as much as it's social fissures. And the reality is we are not all born into equal circumstances. And so some of us are separated into enclaves where we really don't get much information about the world around us. Some of us are desperately poor and don't have access to resources that many in society take for granted. So one of the great things about public schools is that it brings people together and gives them a fair chance at having what everybody else has. That's why they're so valuable, and that's why they call it the engine of a democracy, because we're doing something so fantastic, and that is bringing everybody in to give them a fair chance. But when they come, they have not always had the same resources. And so I feel that way as a college professor. Not every student in my class has the same aptitude and ability, and I have to teach them all. And so that's what teachers learn to do. That's what schools do, is to bring people together of diverse backgrounds and level the playing field in a sense, so that when they graduate, they have a fair chance of living the kinds of lives they'd like to live.
When you do the research you've done, you have showed, one of the things you tried to show, and I've gone to the website, the problem is with me, it's a rabbit hole for me. I go in and I dig in, and about 3 days later I come out with all this knowledge that I don't know what to do with. But one of the challenges you're trying to find out is about the levels of equity or lack thereof, and how it can change and maybe affect things for the better. What kinds of research feedback are you getting about that? I
mean, we did a study over the course of 2+ years in partnership with HISD, trying to understand what equity looked like in everything from pre-K to post-secondary opportunities and sort of everything that falls in between. And so we share that research with the departments, and they're using it actively to make decisions. So for example, some of our early work was on pre-K access, and we told HISD there are some students who don't have equitable access to pre-K. Right. So the populations of students who would qualify in the state of Texas for free pre-K aren't more likely to have it than their peers. And so as a result of that, HISD opened 24 new pre-K classrooms in the district this year. So that's just one example of how they're trying to use it tangibly. To Ruth's point, we don't ask questions for the sake of asking questions. When HISD comes to us and says, can you help us understand X, Y, and Z, we say, how are you going to use that? What decision are you trying to make? So that we make sure that we are helping inform them in that way.
I want to touch back on something you said during our interview on Newsmakers, talking about the cost per pupil and how that can help take care of some of the issues that some of the students are having. And HISD, even though it's numbers, it's, for lack of a better word, the scores that students have, the socioeconomic groups that in HISD are lower than they should be, but they're higher than what the average is across the rest of the country.
So funding is very, very important, and this, sometimes we hear people's reactions when we say that, which is often it's something like, well, we can't just throw money at the problem. And I understand, excuse me, I understand what they're trying to get at, but the reality is that while funding may not be sufficient, it's necessary. It's a necessary starting point. And if we don't have the funding that is needed for students to be able to perform well, especially for our most disadvantaged students, then we can't begin to talk about everything else. So funding is at a bare minimum, it is necessary for students. And so what we've seen through research, there are some researchers at Stanford, for example, that have looked at over 450 million test scores. They've taken test scores from every school district in the nation over a period of about 10 years. And if you look at the scatter plot, you see very clearly that the socioeconomic status of the families plays a very important role in determining the academic outcomes. That's true for Black students, for Hispanic students, for white students. It's the same thing. All students with a higher socioeconomic status perform better. But when we also take a look at that scatter plot and look at HISD specifically, and we split it up by race and ethnicity, we see that, yes, Black and brown students are the most disadvantaged, and therefore they're also performing at lower levels. However, given their socioeconomic status, they're actually performing better than expected compared to other similar students nationwide.
I think about you, Dr. Simmons, the youngest of 12 children. You would be in that category of growing up in poverty. You would be in that category of low socioeconomic. So the difference between what it takes, what does it take for someone to go, you're exceptional, so that's really not fair to maybe use you as an example, but I am, to go from where you were as a child when people would have looked at you and thought, you said this in our program earlier, they wouldn't have expected you to achieve.
No.
What was the difference? What was it, a spark? Was it a teacher? Was it a teacher in the classroom? What was it that made the difference for you?
Well, first of all, I was born into low expectations as a Black child in Jim Crow. My life was shaped by low expectations. I couldn't do this, I couldn't do that, I'd never be able to ascend to this or that. School can change those expectations. And what happened to me is that teachers stepped onto my path and said, oh no, you don't have to be this. You don't have to be limited in that way. If you work hard and you expand your learning, you'll be able to do wonderful things. So that was one, changing the expectations. Secondly, the demands. A laissez-faire environment for a socioeconomically disadvantaged child says, don't even worry. You don't have to try very hard, and you don't have to go to school and work hard either, because it doesn't matter. We'll never get anywhere. So you also want to make sure that that hard work becomes ingrained in a child's life, where they understand that there is a direct relationship between the effort they put in and the result that they get. And so I learned that if I worked hard, I got praise from my teachers. And for the youngest of 12, always getting grief from my siblings, it was lovely to get praise, okay? And so I fed off of that praise. And then teachers got very invested in pushing me along. And I knew I couldn't go to college. That wasn't possible for my family. But teachers said, wait a minute, no, we'll find a way for you to go to college. So the fact is that putting these children in touch with people who are trained to encourage them, trained to set highest expectations for them, trained to prove to them what work can deliver in their lives and so forth, they take them in hand. And that's why we've got to do so much for our teachers and pay them more and celebrate them, because standing between that child and the future they can have is a teacher. And that is the most important thing that we can deliver to all of our children, is that kind of intervention.
And I know that your research through the years, what you're doing is providing the basic information to let the school district know what they need to give teachers what they need and give students and parents what they need to move forward as well. And you're providing research, information, data to those who are making decisions about what to do about TEA and HISD. What would you want them to know? We're wrapping this up now, but what do you want TEA to know most passionately about the information you're providing them and what they should do about HISD and the chances they might give them going forward?
There's very clear evidence about what works and not so clear evidence about takeovers, right? So we've seen that takeovers tend to not be helping students perform better, and that's the goal in theory of what the takeover would do. But we know funding, time and time again, making sure we're spending enough on teachers and resources and our students, that's something that's been proven to work.
Doctor?
There is a role for the state. I don't want to make it sound like, oh, I don't think the state should do anything here. Absolutely, we applaud that. We applaud that the state is concerned about HISD and all the other districts in the state, and absolutely they should play a role. But we think that role should be founded on the most research evidence that we have that's very clear without a doubt is funding helps, and it helps a lot. When it comes to state takeovers, it doesn't seem to help, and why take a risk on something so consequential for so many lives when we have clear evidence over here?
Dr. Lopez-Turley, thank you. Dr. Baumgartner, thank you. Dr. Simmons, thank you very much. This is Newsmakers Extra. This should be shared with everyone you know, especially those on the state level who make decisions about education.